Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Dorothea Smartt's poetry collection Ship Shape, which is written about and inspired by an unknown or an unnamed slave who died in Lancaster, England in 1736. He's become a sort of piece of Lancaster folklore, apparently, because the story is that he was brought over to the UK as the slave of a ship's captain, and then when this slave was left in an inn in Lancaster, he refused to eat, supposedly out of grief at being left by this captain, until he died, and he was buried in an unknown, or he was buried in a grave that basically says, he basically tells this story that like he was pining for his master, and he's called Samboo, which I guess is the sort of Lancaster pronunciation maybe of Sambo, which is a not particularly common anymore racial slur, sort of moderate racial slur. So I'm not going to say it more than is required by reading the poems, but that's what the majority of the poems in this collection are about, is trying to sort of come to grips with this person who lived and died, and then became part of the city's folklore in this weird way, because one of the things that Smart really focuses on in the poems is how Lancaster sort of repressed the awareness of its own role in the slave trade, and the fact that that's where a lot of families' money came from. So there's a lot of interesting components to this in terms of this sort of, it's a post-colonial collection in a lot of ways, because it is writing back to the imperial center, or in this case more specifically the slave trading center, and asserting the legitimacy of African voices and African experience, and confronting the imperial center with guilt over its role in slavery. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to read a number of poems, so pairs of poems typically, because they illustrate interesting things that run throughout the collection. So the first poem I'm going to read is called Untitled. He has no name but Samboo, filled with your pity and remorse. I wonder if this grave is empty, because he's no one. Lancaster can name him for its past, not his people's, bury him under its myths. If he's there at all, could Lancaster say his names? Or would the accent slur to Samboo? You thought you saw him. Did he say his name was Samboo? That's who you saw. And then immediately following that is a poem called Bring It All Back Home. Here I lie, a hollow Samboo, filled with your tears and regrets, the tick in the eye of Lancaster pride, the stutter, the pause, the dry cough, shifting, eyes cannot meet a black man's gaze. Questions for either side that foul us for answers. The how and the why ultimately defeating us with shame, with anger, and with the defensive voices of those who lived and enjoyed the benefits, who did not question too deeply the source that enriched all of Lancaster life. Who will heal and elevate to light the souls of your ancestors if you refuse to remember? If you cover their incarnations with half-truths? Grocer, you are a slave trader, and everything has its price, and denial is only debt with interest to be paid. So in these poems, in the early part of the collection, the big component is really about Lancaster's refusal to fully come to terms with its role as a major slave trading port, with the fact that people's money was made off of human flesh. And so this idea of sort of failure to recognize, the inability to name this unknown slave. This sort of represents Lancaster's inability to accept its own responsibility for the slave trade. And so we get that as a major recurring theme. We get that also in the next couple of poems that I'm going to read as well, which are in a way more personal, because they reflect on the kinds of individual justifications or individual blindness that residents of Lancaster might have to try and repress or ignore the fact that they were involved in slave trading. So the first one is called A Sailor's Life Too. And it starts with a quote from Camus Braithwaite's Littoral. And I, Quaker, praying, my broad hat under the turmoil of stars, and I, slaver, slaying, my bright whip ripping a new soil of scars. And then into the Smart's poem. A letter by the ship's captain alarms me with its absences. No horrors of his every day, no word of this to his ailing wife. Only his wishes to journey with her to healing waters, Harrogate Spa. He documents the minutiae of his household, while the ship is a void. No storms, no shanties, no hollering of the crew as they cast a black body overboard. Only his Christian 20 manning a brigantine with 200 heaving Africans incarcerated below. And then this is followed up with the captain's wife's story, which is in some ways a response. It was after a dinner with the West Indian guest agent from a plantation tied to my husband's ship that the dreams came and my soul's light dimmed to dis-ease that poured out in fainting spells and anonymous pains of the body. I began to fade, a fatigue from wrestling aside an incubus, my loving husband a slave ship captain, agent of the interests of Lancaster's Quakers, now gross grocers, their faith displaced by greed. Now in the chiming of our crafted Gillows clock I hear his ship's bell toll and enter an underworld inflicted with anxiety and guilt. The ship, my husband's ship, moored in blood, dispersing merchandise into the Loon for our local grocers' trade in slaves, merchants and seamen spilling onto the quayside, fertilizes the terrors of my nervous condition. His hands and eyes hold me with love, the same hands that strip the Negro of his flesh, prise open, dig the enslaved's wounds, stroking them with briny waters for discipline. On our pilgrimage to curative mineral waters to heal me of my breach, I only bubble with blood, keeping nothing down. So, again, building off of this sort of idea of Lancaster being incapable of recognizing its own complicity in the slave trade, in these two poems we have very specific repression techniques, these sort of strategies of not discussing slavery and the slave trade and the horrors of what goes on in the triangle trade, in this transatlantic trip where slaves were transported under absolutely horrendous conditions and things like this. The unwillingness to talk about it, and yet, interestingly enough, in the captain's wife's story, it's there. It's clearly something that the people of Lancaster are aware of, and it rots them from the inside out. So we get all of those things. The other big thing that occurs a lot in this collection is that Smartt imagines this slave's experience, and she gives him the name Bilal. She sort of imagines a backstory of him as a West African Muslim, and she writes a lot of really beautiful, moving poetry from his perspective or about his experiences, either in the plantation in the West Indies or on the ship that takes him from the West Indies back to Lancaster, or in Lancaster itself. So I'm going to read you a couple of those so you can get a sense of them. The first one is "The Door Locked." And I stood like a plank, staring, door locked. The room did not move, swell, sway like the ship. Small window give light. I could see the ship still on the quay. Captain had not said tie me, but the innkeeper. Innkeeper look at me and see a devil ting. I know he frightened me. I know it. I could a laugh, but I know that fear from the plantation, from the man overseer eyes. Master de eyes. He looks could kill ya. He fear could kill ya stone cold dead. The rope tight. I try to undo my tired hands. So we've got that experience. And this poem is the experience of terror and alienation and fear. But we've also got a lot of poems that are not necessarily hopeful, but maybe optimistic, or that assert Bilal's cultural heritage and his spirit as an individual human being. So we get that, for instance, in "The Upper Room." I frightened to shudder into the drum, frightened for the rhythm riding me body. No way will I succumb. Let drum song shiver through my ears, echo through me, mixing in my hips. Where the drums come from, not from dem sailors downstairs or the hands of that innkeeper, or from the quayside outside, is from me inside, deep seeping from me toes, taking me home to other feet pounding, exulting in the beat. Still I frighten, but I let me pelvis lean into the drum. Where it gon' take me? I travel, and the drums keep on bringing sweat to the side of my neck. So, in this poem we have almost the counterpoint to the previous poem, to "The Door Locked," because this is not about fear. This is about almost the tentative, but still the embrace of culture, of Bilal's culture, of his heritage, as a way of retaining his identity, and in some ways escaping to return home. So that's what most of this collection is. About 3/4 or so of the poems are inspired by Bilal. The last quarter, which is called "Just a Part," is more modern, and it's about the Caribbean, the Caribbean English experience. Because Dorothea Smartt herself is English. She was born in London, I think. Pretty sure. Yeah, she was born in London. But her parents are from Barbados. And so the last poems in the collection explore thematically related concerns, particularly about the difficulty of maintaining links to one's own culture in England, to one's Caribbean culture in England, but also the sort of interconnectedness of trade, particularly about sending things that are easily available in the UK back to family in the Caribbean and things like this. So we've got this poem, "Just a Part, Remittances." It's what keeps people back home going. Family ties and our longing for home. An older sister, she did her best from over here, sending pocket money in small packages. First she takes on her sister's children, not just the boarding school fees, but the uniforms, towels, bedclothes, paper, books, and calculators, so easy to find, so inexpensive, not like at home. When she transplants herself to Milton Keynes, the share of love and family grew to barrels, or the shape of love and family grew to barrels, full of River Island end-of-line clothing, stories of her whole village dressed, bringing a smile. So again, we've got this thematic link with the Bilal poems in the first portion of the collection, because it's about the interactions between the imperial slave trading center in the UK with the Caribbean, with Africa, with these places that are touched and shaped by this colonialist violence. But now it's about how those experiences continue to shape the world in which Caribbean people and Caribbean English people continue to find themselves.